Picture Chicago in the 1920s. The jazz is hot, the nights are alive, and two young guys, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, are cooking up something wild. These two aren't your average Joes. They're geniuses, but the evil kind. They're not just looking to break the rules, they're planning the most infamous crime of the century. Let's recap. Thanks for watching True Crime Recaps. I'm Chris with all the crime in half the time. Buckle up because you're about to find out just how far these two are willing to go to prove they're the smartest guys in the room. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb spent 7 months hammering out each detail of their perfect crime. Kidnapping a child. Now, that will get people's attention. It'll be even better if they demand a ransom from the parents. But that means kidnapping someone whose parents can pay. They land on $10,000 as a reasonable sum. Today, that'd be worth about $180,000. But the big problem is how they're going to collect it without getting caught. What if the victim's father throws the money from a moving train heading south from the city? Yes, that might work. He'll have to wait until the train passes over the elevated tracks west of Lake Michigan. Leopold and Loeb will wait below, ready to scoop up the money and run off into the night. Nothing should be left to chance. Everything that can be done ahead of time should be. They pre-type the ransom notes, writing them in such a way that no matter who they take, the letters will still make sense. Except they're not planning on letting anyone go home. The plan is to get away with murder. It's all about confusion and misdirection. A chisel with the sharp end taped up so it can be used to bludgeon someone will point police toward a hammer or a pipe. If they find the chisel, they'll ignore it because the victim won't be stabbed. With the plan in place, all they have left to do is choose their unlucky victim. They drive around Chicago for hours looking for someone whose parents can pay their $10,000 ransom. Luckily for many young Chicago boys, their parents are too poor. Then Loeb spots 14-year-old Bobby Franks walking home from school. Loeb knows Bobby's family. He's actually a distant cousin. Bobby's father is a prominent businessman who can easily pay the ransom. "Hey, Bobby," Loeb calls from the window. The boy turns around at the sound of Richard's voice. They go back and forth. Loeb tells Bobby to get in the car and they'll drive him home. Bobby says he'd rather walk. The boys feel their opportunity slipping through their fingers. "Well, get in a minute," Loeb says. "I want to ask you about a certain tennis racket." Bobby loves tennis. Leopold opens the door. Bobby hops in. "You don't mind if we drive around the corner, do you?" Loeb asks. Bobby shakes his head no. Leopold takes a sharp left and without warning, his partner puts a hand over Bobby's mouth and cracks him over the head with the chisel's blunt end. Loeb hits him over and over again. Bobby thrashes in the front seat, trying desperately to defend himself. The fourth and final blow cracks open his forehead. Blood gushes down his face and floods the front seat. Worried someone will see, Loeb pulls Bobby into the back. He finishes the job by stuffing a rag in Bobby's mouth and securing it with tape. According to Leopold's statement, Bobby died instantly by suffocation. Some killers aren't shaped by the world around them. They step right into the light wearing masks to hide their darkness. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were raised in Kenwood, a well-to-do Jewish neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Leopold, already a student since 1919, is a prodigy with a passion for studying birds. He comes from a rich and powerful family. Loeb also comes from money. His father is vice president of Sears. Like Leopold, Loeb is also incredibly bright. But he likes playing cards, not going to class. His slipping grades forced him to transfer to the University of Michigan, where he graduated at the age of 18. By then, Nathan Leopold has also graduated from University of Chicago at the top of his class and enrolled in law school. He allegedly speaks 14 languages and has an IQ of 200. According to history, he also has some unusual sexual desires. Luckily, his old friend Richard is back in town. It doesn't take long for their friendship to turn into something more. By the fall of 1923, Leopold and Loeb have an arrangement. Richard will act out Nathan's wildest fantasies, but only if he helps him pull off the ultimate crime. Out in Michigan, Richard got a taste for the criminal life. He started small, stealing cars, lighting fires, but let's face it, small-time crimes only get your heart racing so much. Loeb craves a bigger thrill. He's obsessed with the idea of pulling off the perfect crime, and who better to help than Leopold? Leopold is all about Nietzsche. He's fixated on the whole Übermensch concept. concept, the Superman. And no, not the cape-wearing hero. Nietzsche's Superman is beyond the usual rules of right and wrong. This Superman follows his own desires, no matter what society says or who gets hurt along the way. Like, if a kid rips the wings off a fly just to see what happens, well, that's okay as long as he learns something from it. Like how the fly can't buzz around anymore without its wings. Anything goes in the pursuit of knowledge. They start small with an attempt to rob a frat house in Michigan in November 1923. Their big heist is kind of a flop. They end up with just $80 and change, a few watches, and a typewriter. Not exactly the payday they were hoping for, especially with the long drive back to Chicago ahead of them. The whole ride back, they go at it like an old married couple. Leopold's feeling like things are a bit one-sided, wondering if Loeb is maybe a little embarrassed about this thing between them. But Loeb knows just what to say to smooth things over. He promises Leopold he's all in, and what better way to prove it than pulling off a stunt that will have everyone in Chicago buzzing. For the next 7 months, they hash out the who, the how, and the getting away with it part. It all kicked off on May 21st, 1924. With 14-year-old Bobby Franks dead on the floor in the back seat of the car, Leopold and Loeb drive across the border into Indiana, where they stop for sandwiches. It is dinner time, after all. After dinner, they drive to a deserted portion of the railroad tracks. They strip Bobby naked and drag his body toward a drainage pipe by the track. To try and hide his identity, they pour hydrochloric acid over his face and body. Then they push him as far as they can into the pipe. It's at this point Leopold makes a crucial mistake. He doesn't notice his glasses have fallen out of his pocket. Before going home, Leopold calls Bobby's mother from a public phone. He says the boy is safe and she should await further instructions. Their plan blows up in their face the very next morning. A man walking home from his midnight shift decided to take a shortcut near the Pennsylvania Railroad. The walk brought him right by the drainage pipe where he discovered Bobby's body. Meanwhile, Bobby's father gets the first ransom letter in the mail. It tells him to gather $10,000 in old bills, $2,020 bills, and $8,050 bills. If he strays from the plan or tries to contact the police, the kidnappers will kill his son. Except he doesn't have to call the police. The cops are already at his door. They were able to identify Bobby's body right away because the acid didn't really work the way Leopold and Loeb thought it would. They also find Leopold's glasses, which wouldn't have been that big of a deal if they weren't so rare. His glasses are one of only 3 sets made in Chicago. The other 2 sets belong to people who couldn't have committed the crime. Police don't suspect Nathan Leopold at first. He's a smart kid from a highly respected family. There's got to be another explanation. Maybe the killer stole his glasses and dropped them at the scene. To rule him out, they bring him in for questioning. Leopold says he and his friend Richard Loeb were driving around that night in Leopold's car. The alibi might have worked, except the police found a letter from Leopold to Loeb suggesting they were lovers. It discredited Loeb as his alibi. Of course, he'd lie for his lover. The family's chauffeur blew their cover when he told police that Leopold's car was in the garage all day being worked on during the murder. Their story crumbles, and both confess to killing Bobby Franks. It's an open and shut case. Both boys will surely hang. At least, that's what the state prosecutor thinks. He should have known that rich folks rarely hang. They hired the best criminal defense lawyer around, Clarence Darrow. He's the Johnny Cochran to their O.J. Simpson. He has a knack for winning impossible cases and making confident prosecutors look like idiots. In this case, his job isn't to prove their innocence. All he has to do is convince the judge not to execute his clients, even though younger criminals have been hanged in Chicago for less. To this day, the Leopold and Loeb case is important for a couple of reasons. It's among the first publicized radio trials. Imagine Mom, Dad, little George, and baby Sue huddled around the radio listening to the trial like 1920s Scott Peterson. It's also the first time a lawyer uses mental health as a defense. Clarence Darrow bends over backwards, claiming Leopold and Loeb suffer from undiagnosed conditions that pushed them towards this heinous crime. He plays every card he can, possibly Possibly one or both of them was sexually abused as kids. Their rich parents ignored them their whole lives. They were so smart they didn't have a normal childhood, etc., etc. Psychologists on both sides battle it out in court. Their professional conclusions only support the side that hired them. The New York Times calls it an evil that contaminated the entire profession. How could experts in their field, when presented with the same set of facts, come to different conclusions that only seem to bolster their side of the courtroom? Of course, these days, that's exactly what you'd expect. Because they pleaded guilty, Leopold and Loeb avoided a jury trial. It's up to the judge to decide their fates. Will they hang or spend the rest of their lives in jail? On September 10th, 1924, around 9:30 a.m., the judge reaches his decision. It broadcasts live over public radio, making it one of the first live court dramas in American history. All of Chicago grinds to a halt and listens to the verdict. Darrow wins the day. The judge sentences Leopold and Loeb to 99 years for kidnapping and life in prison for the murder of Bobby Franks. Loeb's life doesn't last much longer. He's stabbed in the shower by a fellow inmate in 1936. Doctors try their best, but Loeb bleeds to death on the operating table. He was 30 years old. Nathan Leopold walks free on parole after 33 years in prison. Every newspaper and talk show wants to tell his story, but Leopold refuses. He moves to Puerto Rico, gets married, and goes back to studying birds. In the 1960s, he finally came back to Chicago to lay flowers on his parents' graves. He died of a heart attack in August of 1971. He was 66 years old. And there you have it, the twisted tale of Leopold and Loeb, a story where brilliance crossed into the dark side, proving that intellect without empathy can lead to unthinkable acts. If you liked this recap, let us know with a thumbs up and remember to subscribe so you always get your crime in half the time. What do you think drove Leopold and Loeb to commit such a heinous act? Let's get the conversation going. See you in the comments.